Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the USS Frontier and watched the impossible sight through the main screen. The alien ship hung in space like a silver needle 10 times longer than his own vessel. Its surface was smooth and perfect without any visible weapons or engines yet. It moved through space with grace that made human technology look clumsy. Admiral Lisa Hamilton received the transmission at Earth Command 3 hours after first contact. Her hands shook as she read Jake's report. The aliens had responded to human radio signals with perfect English spoken in voices that sounded almost human, but carried an odd musical quality that made her skin crawl. The aliens called themselves Zilithians, and their leader introduced himself. As High Commander Vextar through the communication link, his image appeared on screens across Earth, showing a tall being with pale blue skin and large dark eyes that seemed to study everything with cold interest. His voice was calm and measured. As he spoke to the gathered leaders of humanity, "We have observed your species for some time and find you interesting enough to offer membership in our Galactic Alliance," Vextar said, with what might have been a smile. "We represent 47 worlds that have chosen to join us in peace and prosperity. Your world would make a fine addition to our empire." President Helen Carter sat in the emergency session of world leaders and felt her stomach turn cold. The alien's words sounded generous, but something in his tone suggested this was not really an offer. The way he said empire instead of alliance made several delegates shift uncomfortably in their seats. Dr. Nathan Pierce had been studying the alien transmissions for days now, and what he found troubled him deeply. The Zilithians spoke about other species the way humans might discuss livestock or resources. Their language had no words for concepts like individual rights or personal freedom. When they mentioned the 47 worlds they had brought into their alliance, Pierce noticed they never used words like chose or decided. Lieutenant Amy Foster worked in the communications division and had been monitoring alien radio traffic that wasn't meant for human ears. The Zilithians thought their encrypted channels were secure, but human computers had found patterns in their signals. What Amy discovered made her blood run cold. The aliens referred to humanity as Subject Classification Omega, which in their files meant a species marked for either total control or elimination. Jake Morrison met with the alien delegation aboard their ship and tried to hide his shock at what he saw. The Zilithians moved with mechanical precision and showed no emotional reactions to anything they encountered. When he mentioned that forced relocation would separate families, the aliens looked genuinely confused, as if the concept meant nothing to them. High Commander Vextar explained the terms of membership with the patience of someone reading a grocery list humanity would need to surrender all weapons technology and military vessels. Earth would be evacuated, and humans relocated to 3 colony worlds, where they would be assigned jobs based on aptitude tests. The Zilithian Empire would provide everything humans needed in exchange for complete cooperation. "The evacuation of Earth is necessary for your protection," Vextar explained when Jake asked why humans couldn't stay on their home world. "Your planet sits in a strategically important location and will be converted to serve the greater good of the Empire. Your species will find the colony worlds more than adequate for your needs." Dr. Pierce studied recordings of the alien meetings and noticed something that made his hands shake. The Zilithians never blinked when they spoke of relocating billions of people or dismantling human civilization. Their heart rates never changed when discussing the destruction of Earth's cities. They approached the conquest of humanity like solving a math problem. Admiral Hamilton called an emergency meeting of Earth's military leaders and shared what intelligence had gathered. The Zilithians had followed the same pattern with every species they conquered. First came the generous offer wrapped in promises of protection and prosperity. Then came the systematic destruction of everything that made each species unique. General Kevin Brooks studied the alien ship designs and felt his hope drain away. The Zilithian vessels used energy sources that human science barely understood. Their weapons could vaporize entire city blocks, and their shields could deflect anything in Earth's arsenal. A direct military confrontation would last maybe hours before humanity was completely defeated. The aliens gave humanity 30 days to accept their offer of membership. Captain Morrison transmitted their final message to Earth and could hear the threat beneath the polite words. If humanity chose to reject their generous terms, the Zilithians would be forced to use alternative methods to ensure galactic stability. Amy Foster continued monitoring alien communications and discovered the true horror of what alternative methods meant. The Zilithians had detailed files on human population centers and had already calculated optimal targets for what they called pacification bombardment. They planned to destroy major cities until human resistance collapsed. President Carter addressed the world and tried to keep her voice steady as she explained humanity's situation. The aliens had superior technology and overwhelming numbers, but they had made one crucial mistake. They assumed humans would react to threats the same way other species had, Dr. Pierce presented his analysis to the Emergency Council and explained what made the Zilithians so dangerous. They operated on pure logic, without emotion or individual attachment. They saw species as numbers in equations and conquest as a mathematical certainty. Their biggest weakness was that they couldn't understand any form of thinking that wasn't based on cold calculation. Jake Morrison returned to Earth with a final alien ultimatum and delivered it to Admiral Hamilton. The message was simple and terrifying. Accept relocation and disarmament or face the consequences of defying the galactic order. The Zilithians couldn't comprehend why any species would choose destruction over slavery. The world held its breath as leaders debated humanity's response. Some argued for acceptance, claiming that survival under alien rule was better than extinction. Others demanded resistance even if it meant the end of human civilization. The aliens waited in their perfect ships, confident that logic would prevail and humanity would make the rational choice. But High Commander Vextar had made a fatal error in his calculations. He assumed that humans would value survival over freedom and that fear would overcome pride. What he didn't understand was that human logic could be far more ruthless than alien mathematics and that some things were worth dying for, even if it made no sense. President Helen Carter stood before the emergency session of world leaders and made the decision that would define humanity's future. We reject the Zilithian offer, she announced with a voice that carried across every screen on Earth. Humanity will not surrender its freedom or abandon its homeworld regardless of the consequences. General Kevin Brooks had been preparing for this moment since the first alien transmission arrived. Operation Ironwall began within hours of the president's announcement. Every military base on Earth activated hidden protocols that had been developed in secret military factories, switched to producing weapons and ships using designs that pushed human technology to its absolute limits. The Zilithian fleet grew larger, each day as more silver ships arrived at the edge of the solar system. High Commander Vextar transmitted daily messages expressing confusion at humanity's irrational response. He could not understand why humans would choose certain destruction over comfortable slavery. His mathematical models showed no possible scenario where Earth could resist their overwhelming force. Commander Sam Rodriguez led a desperate mission that most considered suicide. His team used a captured Zilithian scout ship to infiltrate one of their communication hubs deep in space. The mission was dangerous beyond calculation, but the intelligence they gathered would prove invaluable to humanity's survival. What Sam's team discovered in the alien databases made their blood run cold. The Zilithians had conquered 47 civilizations using identical tactics. Each species had been offered the same generous terms, and each had eventually accepted when faced with overwhelming force. The pattern was always the same: technological demonstration, followed by generous offers, then systematic elimination of everything that made each species unique. The files showed the fate of species that had accepted Zilithian membership. The Karathi had been brilliant engineers, but now served as mindless workers in alien factories. The Thessian had created beautiful art, but their culture was erased and their people assigned numbers instead of names. Every conquered species became tools for the Empire with no memory of what they had once been. Dr. Miranda Cole studied the alien tactics and presented her analysis to Earth's leadership. The Zilithians expected humanity to follow the same pattern as every other species. They had calculated human response, timed psychological breaking points and social collapse scenarios. But their models were based on species that valued individual survival above all else. We have one advantage the aliens cannot understand, Cole explained to the War Council. They assume fear will make us surrender. But human history shows we often fight hardest when facing impossible odds. Their mathematical approach cannot account for actions that appear completely irrational. Colonel Pete Johnson oversaw the construction of weapon platforms hidden throughout the solar system. The aliens knew about Earth's obvious military installations, but they had no idea about the secret bases built inside asteroids or the missile systems disguised as communication satellites. Human engineers worked around the clock to turn every piece of space debris into a potential weapon. Dr. Linda Hayes developed communication networks that used quantum entanglement to send messages instantly across vast distances. The Zilithians could jam radio signals and intercept digital transmissions, but they had no defense against quantum communications. This gave human forces the ability to coordinate attacks that the aliens could neither predict nor prevent. The Zilithian delegation met with human representatives one final time, and High Commander Vextar made his last attempt at reasonable negotiation. Your resistance serves no logical purpose, he explained with the patience of someone talking to children. Our fleet contains 200 capital ships, each more powerful than your entire military. Your defeat is mathematically certain. Ambassador Don Baker delivered humanity's response with words that would echo through history. We have calculated the long-term survival of our species under your rule and found the probability to be 0. Therefore, any action that preserves human independence regardless of immediate cost is logically justified. We choose to fight. Vextar stared at the human diplomat with something that might have been confusion or anger. The concept of choosing certain death over comfortable slavery was beyond his understanding. No species in Zilithian history had ever made such an irrational decision. His perfect mathematical models had no variable for this kind of thinking. Captain Ryan Cooper prepared his battle group for humanity's first engagement with the alien fleet. He knew his 30 ships had no chance against 200 Zilithian vessels, but the goal was not victory. The human plan was to inflict maximum damage while gathering intelligence about alien weaknesses. Every human death would serve a purpose in the larger war. Engineer Tracy Miller had spent months converting civilian infrastructure into weapon systems. Mining equipment became kinetic bombardment platforms. Commercial satellites transformed into guided missiles. Manufacturing plants switched from producing consumer goods to creating weapons that existed nowhere in human military doctrine. The aliens watched human preparations with growing confusion instead of the expected panic. Zilithian intelligence reported that humans were evacuating cities but not fleeing the planet. They were converting civilian areas into military targets and treating their own infrastructure as disposable ammunition. This behavior was unprecedented in galactic history. Major Chris Lee commanded ground forces on Mars and received orders that no military academy had ever taught. His job was not to defend human colonies, but to turn them into elaborate traps. When the aliens came to occupy Mars, they would find empty cities rigged with explosives and civilians who had been relocated to hidden underground facilities. The Zilithians began broadcasting messages directly to human civilians, offering individual surrender terms. They promised safety and comfort to anyone willing to abandon their governments and submit to alien authority. But human response rates were lower than any conquered species in their files. Most humans seemed willing to die rather than betray their own kind. Admiral Susan Clark studied alien battle formations and identified their greatest weakness. The Zilithians fought with perfect mathematical precision, but they had never faced an enemy willing to sacrifice everything for victory. Human tactics would be based on acceptable loss calculations that made no sense to alien logic. High Commander Vextar reviewed his invasion plans and felt something he had never experienced before. Uncertainty. Human behavior was so far outside normal parameters that his battle computers could not generate reliable predictions. How do you fight an enemy that treats certain death as an acceptable outcome for uncertain victory? The 30-day deadline approached, and both sides prepared for war. The Zilithians expected quick victory followed by the usual pattern of surrender and integration, but humanity had spent those 30 days becoming something the galaxy had never seen before, a species that had decided survival was less important than freedom. As the final hours ticked away, Vextar sent one last message to Earth, offering reduced terms and partial autonomy. But President Carter's response was broadcast across every human world. "We have made our choice and we will live or die by it. Come and take what you can from us, but know that every human you face has already accepted death as the price of defiance." Fleet Admiral Zormak commanded the Zilithian assault force with the confidence of someone who had never known defeat. His 200 capital ships moved into Earth space with mathematical precision while his computers calculated optimal attack patterns based on 47 previous conquests. The mathematics were simple, overwhelming force applied systematically until the enemy surrendered. Captain Ryan Cooper stood on the bridge of the USS Vengeance and watched the alien fleet approach. Through his tactical display, his 30 ships were arranged in a formation that made no military sense to any textbook. But human strategy had abandoned conventional wisdom weeks ago. The goal was not survival, but maximum damage per ship lost. The first battle began at 0600 hours when human ships opened fire at impossible range, using weapons that should not have worked. Captain Cooper led the opening attack with tactics that confused Zilithian battle computers. Instead of retreating when faced with superior firepower, human ships accelerated toward the enemy fleet and began ramming attacks against the largest targets. Zormak watched in shock as human vessels deliberately destroyed themselves to damage his flagship. The USS Vengeance struck his command ship's engine section and both vessels exploded in a fireball that lit up space for thousands of kilometers. The attack made no tactical sense, but it crippled his most powerful ship and disrupted his entire battle line. The Zilithians had expected human ships to retreat when outgunned, but instead they found themselves fighting an enemy that treated their own vessels as guided missiles. Human captains broadcast final messages before impact, providing intelligence about alien weak points and encouraging their comrades to aim for the same targets. Engineer Tracy Miller watched the battle from her command center on Luna and began implementing the second phase of human strategy. The aliens had dismissed Earth's civilian infrastructure as irrelevant to military operations, but Tracy had spent months turning every satellite communication array and mining station into a weapon system. Commercial mining platforms throughout the asteroid belt suddenly activated and began hurling massive chunks of rock toward the Zilithian fleet at incredible speeds. The aliens had not considered civilian equipment as a military threat, but human engineers had weaponized everything from garbage collection ships to weather monitoring satellites. The Zilithian fleet found themselves under attack from directions their sensors had not monitored. Communications satellites became suicide bombers. Space elevators launched their cargo pods as kinetic weapons. Even the International Space Station detached from Earth orbit and guided itself toward the enemy fleet loaded with explosives. Zormak tried to adapt his battle plans, but human tactics made no sense according to any military doctrine in Zilithian history. The humans were using their own infrastructure as ammunition and treating billion-dollar installations as disposable weapons. His computers could not calculate strategies against an enemy willing to destroy everything they owned. Major Chris Lee commanded the defense of Mars as Zilithian ground forces attempted their first planetary landing. The aliens expected to find fortified positions and military installations, but instead discovered that humans had evacuated entire cities and turned them into elaborate traps. The Zilithians landed in the capital city of New Geneva, expecting fierce resistance but found empty streets and abandoned buildings. Their advance units moved cautiously through the deserted urban area while their sensors detected no human life signs. The silence was more unsettling than any battle cry. Chris had spent weeks preparing the city for the alien arrival. Every building was rigged with explosives timed to detonate in sequence. The goal was not to stop the invasion, but to inflict maximum casualties while gathering intelligence about alien ground tactics. The entire city had become a single massive weapon. When the Zilithian forces reached the city center, Chris triggered the detonation sequence from his hidden command post 20 kilometers underground. The explosions were visible from orbit as block after block of the city collapsed on top of the alien soldiers. The psychological effect was devastating to enemy morale. The surviving Zilithians retreated to their landing craft and reported something unprecedented in their military history. An entire city had been sacrificed just to kill a few thousand enemy troops. The mathematics made no sense because the economic value of the destroyed infrastructure far exceeded any tactical advantage gained. Admiral Susan Clark had studied Zilithian battle formations and identified their greatest weakness. They fought with perfect coordination using computer-controlled movements that assumed enemy behavior would follow logical patterns. But human tactics were deliberately irrational and unpredictable. Susan commanded the defense of Europa, where human forces had built hidden bases beneath the moon's frozen surface. The Zilithians expected a straightforward, orbital bombardment followed by ground occupation, but human engineers had turned the moon's natural geysers into a defensive weapon. When the alien fleet approached Europa's orbit, Susan activated systems that used the moon's ice geysers as natural camouflage for missile launches. The Zilithians found themselves under attack from weapons they could not see, while human ships emerged from hiding places inside the ice formations. The Battle of Europa became the first major Zilithian defeat in their empire's history. Admiral Clark's forces destroyed 30 alien capital ships while losing only 5 human vessels. The victory was possible because humans had been willing to spend years preparing the moon as a single massive trap-high commander. Vextar reviewed battle reports from across the solar system and struggled to understand what had gone wrong. His forces possessed superior technology and overwhelming numbers, but human tactics were creating impossible situations that his computers could not solve. The humans fought like no species in galactic history. They treated their own lives and property as expendable resources in service of abstract concepts like freedom and independence. When faced with certain defeat, they found ways to turn losing battles into tactical victories by changing the definition of victory itself. Captain Jake Morrison led a suicide mission to destroy a Zilithian communication hub by piloting his ship directly into the enemy installation. His final transmission became a rallying cry for human forces everywhere. We may not win this war, but we will make them remember the price of trying to enslave humanity. The war entered a new phase as both sides realized that conventional military thinking no longer applied. The Zilithians possessed better weapons and more ships, but humans had weaponized concepts like sacrifice and martyrdom that alien logic could not counter. Zilithian intelligence tried to understand human psychology, but their analysis kept reaching the same impossible conclusion. Humans appeared to value abstract ideas more than their own survival. This created tactical situations where normal cost-benefit calculations became meaningless. The alien empire had conquered 47 worlds using mathematical precision and overwhelming force, but humanity represented something they had never encountered before, a species that could calculate acceptable losses in ways that made victory more expensive than defeat. As battles raged across the solar system, both sides began to understand that this war would not follow the usual pattern. The Zilithians could destroy human military forces, but they could not conquer a species that refused to be conquered and treated death as an acceptable price for defiance. The mathematics of war had changed, and for the first time in their history, the Zilithians faced an enemy whose ruthless logic was more terrifying than their own. High Commander Vextar stared at the battle reports from across human space and felt something his species had no word for doubt. His mathematically perfect empire was being torn apart by creatures that made decisions based on concepts his computers could not quantify. The humans treated individual survival as less important than abstract ideas, which created tactical situations that defied all logic. Captain Jim Turner received the most dangerous mission in human military history. His ship, the USS Defiance, would carry a computer virus deep into Zilithian space to infect their central command networks. The mission had a calculated survival probability of 0.3%, but Turner's crew volunteered without hesitation because they understood the strategic importance. Programmer Kate Wilson had spent months developing the virus that would disrupt Zilithian computational systems. The aliens relied on perfect mathematical coordination for everything from fleet movements to supply logistics. Kate's creation would introduce random errors into their calculations, turning their greatest strength into a fatal weakness. The journey to the Zilithian home system took 3 weeks through enemy-controlled space. Captain Turner and his crew knew they would not return, but they treated the mission like any other assignment. Their calm acceptance of certain death confused Zilithian interceptors, who could not understand why the human ship continued toward obvious destruction. Dr. Frank Moore had been studying human military history and found patterns that explained their current success. Every major human victory had come from willingness to accept costs that enemies considered unacceptable, from ancient Sparta to modern. Earth humans had won impossible battles by redefining what victory meant. The Zilithians attempted to negotiate better surrender terms through captured human prisoners, but Ambassador Don Baker delivered humanity's response from his prison cell. We have calculated the probability of species survival under your empire and found it to be 0. Therefore, any action that preserves independence is logically justified, even total extinction. Vextar could not comprehend human reasoning because his species had evolved to value individual preservation above all else. The concept of choosing racial death over comfortable slavery was mathematically impossible according to every model in Zilithian history. No rational species would make such a calculation. The war had entered its 6th month and Zilithian forces controlled most of human space, but victory felt impossible. Every conquered world became a source of guerrilla attacks and sabotage. Human civilians refused to cooperate with occupation forces and seemed willing to die rather than provide assistance to their conquerors. Major Lisa Thompson commanded resistance forces on occupied Venus, where humans had gone underground both literally and figuratively. The Zilithians controlled the surface, but human survivors lived in tunnel systems and emerged only to attack alien installations before disappearing again into the planet's hostile environment. The aliens tried to break human resistance by threatening civilian populations, but discovered that hostages were useless against people who valued freedom more than life. Entire cities chose collective suicide rather than serve as leverage against human military forces, creating psychological trauma among Zilithian occupation. Troops General Kevin Brooks coordinated resistance from a hidden command center in the asteroid belt and marveled at reports from every human world. The pattern was identical everywhere. Zilithian tactical victories were meaningless because humans refused to accept defeat even when facing impossible odds. Captain Turner's mission reached the Zilithian home system, and Kate Wilson's virus began spreading through their central networks. The effect was immediate and devastating. Perfectly coordinated, fleets suddenly found their navigation systems providing conflicting data. Supply ships delivered weapons to random locations. Food distribution networks sent supplies to empty space. The virus targeted Zilithian reliance on mathematical perfection by introducing tiny errors that cascaded through their entire system. Fleet formations broke apart when ships received slightly different movement orders. Supply chains collapsed when computers could not agree on inventory numbers. Even basic communication became unreliable. High Commander Vextar watched his empire begin to crumble from within, and finally understood the true horror of human logic. They had not tried to match Zilithian technology or outfight superior numbers. Instead, they had identified the single point of failure in alien civilization and attacked it with surgical precision. The Zilithian leadership called for peace negotiations, but humanity's terms were simple: complete withdrawal from human space and recognition of Earth's independence. Admiral Hamilton delivered the message with the same calm tone aliens used for mathematical calculations. Our species has decided that freedom is worth any price, including extinction. President Carter addressed the Zilithian High Council through communication channels and explained human reasoning in terms they could understand. We are not emotional or irrational. We simply calculate acceptable losses differently than you do. Our logic is more ruthless than yours, because we place different values on survival. The aliens offered to restore all conquered human worlds and provide massive technological compensation in exchange for peace, but humanity rejected every offer. The war had become a test of will between two completely different forms of logic, and humans had proven their calculations were more terrifying than alien mathematics. Dr. Moore presented his final analysis to Earth's leadership and explained why humanity was winning the war. The Zilithians fought to preserve their empire and minimize losses, but humans fought for concepts that made death preferable to defeat. This fundamental difference made human resistance impossible to break through. Conventional means, Commander Janet Fox led evacuation efforts as the war entered its final phase but discovered something remarkable about human civilian response. Most refugees refused to leave Earth, even when offered safe passage to distant colonies. They preferred to stay and face possible death rather than abandon their homeworld. The Zilithian Empire began experiencing rebellion on other conquered worlds as news of human resistance spread. Species that had accepted slavery decades ago suddenly remembered concepts like freedom and independence. The virus of human defiance was spreading beyond Earth and threatening the entire galactic order. Vextar received reports of uprisings on 17 different worlds as conquered species began following the human example of choosing death over slavery. His perfect mathematical empire was collapsing because humans had introduced variables that his computers could not process. The war had lasted 8 months when Zilithian intelligence finally cracked the human strategic code. They were not fighting to win in any conventional sense. They were fighting to prove that some things were worth dying for, and their example was inspiring revolution throughout the galaxy. Admiral Nick Harris prepared for what might be humanity's final battle, knowing that victory was impossible but surrender was unthinkable. Human forces had been reduced to a few dozen ships and scattered ground units, but they continued fighting because the alternative was accepting that freedom had no value. The Zilithians possessed overwhelming military superiority, but found themselves facing an enemy that turned every defeat into a moral victory and every sacrifice into propaganda for their cause. Human resistance had become a mathematical paradox that threatened the logical foundation of the entire empire, as both sides prepared for the final confrontation. Vextar made a calculation that would have been impossible at the war's beginning. The cost of conquering humanity had exceeded the value of victory, and continuing the war risked destroying everything the Zilithian Empire had built over thousands of years. The humans had won by losing, and their ruthless logic had proven more powerful than alien mathematics. The final battle of the war began at Wolf 359, where the remnants of both fleets gathered for what everyone knew would be the decisive engagement. Captain Matt Young commanded humanity's last dreadnought against High Commander Vextar's personal fleet in a confrontation that would determine the fate of 2 civilizations. The human fleet consisted of 12 damaged ships against 40 pristine Zilithian capital vessels. The mathematics were simple and brutal, but Captain Young had spent months preparing for this moment, not to achieve victory, but to deliver humanity's final message to the galaxy. The battle lasted 6 hours and was visible from Earth as distant flashes of light in the night sky. Human ships fought with desperate courage, but could not match alien firepower. One by one they were destroyed until only Matt Young's flagship remained surrounded by enemy vessels with weapons trained on his bridge. Young opened communication channels to every frequency in known space and delivered the transmission that would echo through galactic history for centuries. We have uploaded the coordinates of every Zilithian world to automated systems throughout human space. Destroy Earth and our revenge. Protocols will sterilize 47 Zilithian colonies within 72 hours. High Commander Vextar stared at the human captain and felt his perfect logical world crumble around him. The humans had spent 8 months of war secretly deploying weapons throughout the galaxy, using their own hyperspace network as the delivery system. Every Zilithian world was now hostage to human revenge. Commander Janet Fox had overseen the evacuation of Earth's civilians, but revealed the true scope of human preparation when Zilithian forces demanded proof of the revenge system. Earth's refugee ships were not fleeing to safety, but positioning themselves as mobile weapons platforms throughout Zilithian space. The automated systems were elegant in their simplicity. Each refugee ship carried enough antimatter to destroy a planet, and was programmed to detonate if Earth was attacked. The Zilithians discovered they had been helping humans position weapons of mass destruction throughout their empire by allowing refugee ships safe passage. Kate Wilson's virus had not just disrupted Zilithian computer networks, but had also mapped their entire civilization for targeting purposes. Every military base, government center, and population hub was now marked for destruction by systems the aliens could neither locate nor disable. Frank Moore's final strategic analysis had predicted this moment perfectly. The Zilithians would achieve tactical victory by destroying human military forces, but would face strategic defeat Through mutually assured destruction, humanity had turned the entire galaxy into a weapon pointed at the Zilithian Empire. Vextar ran calculations on his most advanced computers and found the same result every time. If Earth was destroyed, the automated revenge systems would eliminate 93% of Zilithian civilization within a week. The humans had made conquest more expensive than surrender. President Carter transmitted humanity's final terms from a bunker beneath the ruins of Washington. The conditions were simple: complete Zilithian withdrawal from human space, recognition of Earth's independence, and a promise never to interfere with human expansion. The alternative was mutual extinction. The Zilithian High Council convened an emergency session to debate their response. Some argued for calling the human bluff, believing no species would actually implement such devastating revenge. Others pointed to 8 months of evidence that humans meant exactly what they said. Admiral Nick Harris watched from Earth's orbital defense platforms as Zilithian ships began withdrawing from human space. The aliens had finally calculated the true cost of conquest and found it exceeded any possible benefit. Their perfect logical empire could not survive the introduction of human variables. The withdrawal took 3 days as Zilithian fleets abandoned positions throughout the solar system. High Commander Vextar transmitted a final message to Earth, acknowledging what no alien leader had ever admitted before: the humans had won through superior logic, not superior force. Captain Young's damaged ship limped back to Earth carrying news of humanity's impossible victory. The war was over, not because humans had destroyed their enemies, but because they had proven themselves too dangerous to conquer. Their willingness to embrace mutual destruction had made conquest meaningless. The aftermath of the war saw fundamental changes in galactic civilization. The Zilithian Empire continued to exist, but gave humanity a wide berth, recognizing that some species were too ruthless to control. Other worlds began demanding independence, using human resistance as their model for successful rebellion. Dr. Miranda Cole published her analysis of the conflict and explained why humanity had succeeded where 47 other species had failed. The key was not military strength or technological superiority, but the willingness to calculate acceptable losses in ways that other civilizations found incomprehensible. The IB peace treaty, signed 6 months later, established humanity as a sovereign power with rights to expand freely throughout the galaxy. The Zilithians agreed to these terms because their mathematical models showed that continued conflict would destroy both civilizations. Admiral Susan Clark commanded the new Earth Defense Force and marveled at how quickly the galactic situation had changed. Human ships now moved freely through space that had been enemy territory just months before. The aliens had learned that some opponents were too expensive to defeat. General Kevin Brooks oversaw the construction of permanent defense systems throughout human space, but knew the real protection came from the revenge network still hidden throughout the galaxy. The Zilithians would never again risk the total war that human logic made inevitable. Engineer Tracy Miller began converting wartime weapons back to civilian use, but kept the technical knowledge that had turned everyday infrastructure into instruments of destruction. The lesson was clear: human civilization could become a weapon at any moment if threatened with extinction. The war had cost humanity millions of lives and dozens of worlds, but had established principles that would guide their species for generations. Freedom was worth any price, including mutual destruction, and no alien empire could afford the mathematics of conquering such dangerous opponents. High Commander Vextar retired from military service and spent his remaining years studying human psychology, trying to understand how creatures that appeared so emotional could demonstrate such ruthless logic. His final report concluded that humanity was the most dangerous species in the galaxy, precisely because they were the most willing to die. 5 years after the war ended, Earth had become the unofficial capital of a growing alliance of free worlds. Species throughout the galaxy looked to humanity as proof that independence was possible even against overwhelming odds. The human example had inspired a revolution in galactic politics. Captain Jake Morrison commanded the first human exploration fleet to venture beyond the former war zone, and discovered that their reputation had preceded them. Alien civilizations offered trade agreements and mutual defense pacts, eager to ally with the species that had defeated the Zilithian Empire. The greatest victory was not military but philosophical. Humanity had proven that freedom was mathematically superior to slavery, and that some values were worth infinite cost. The galaxy would never again underestimate the ruthless logic of creatures willing to die for abstract principles. President Carter delivered the final speech of her administration and summarized the lesson learned from 8 months of impossible war. We did not defeat the aliens through superior weapons or greater numbers. We won by proving that our logic was more terrifying than theirs and that human mathematics could calculate costs they dared not imagine.